All right. Hello, YouTube. Assuming my technology is working correctly, we are live. I've already had one little technical glitch, but hello. So, anyways, I am pleased to welcome friend of the show, been here before, Dr. Joshua Bowen. Thanks for coming on.
Oh, no. Thank you for having me.
So there was a number of things that I wanted to talk to you about. I think the title of the live stream is "Death in the Old Testament," but we actually we plan on talking about a number of different things, and then there's some material that we wanted to react to for all of you, and then we will have some time to take some super chat questions at the end here. So we'll dive right into it. I should have asked you this back in the green room or whatever, but I didn't. But about how much time do you have? I want to make sure that we're going to respect that.
Yeah, I think probably hour and 15.
Okay,
Good.
perfect.
I mean, if it goes a little longer, it's fine.
Okay, perfect. That we will make that work. All right. Well, let's get started with it. So, what I had been some like apologetic rhetoric that I had run into lately that I was really curious about, but I wasn't able to find any real information on this on my own, and I figured you'd be a great person to talk to about this. But it's this idea of a lot of numbers given in the Bible, specifically, pretty sure it's just all in the Old Testament. Although I have heard one example of this in the New Testament, but the Old Testament is full of verses that give these enormous numbers of people, and they seem too incredible to be true. Like, for example, in the Exodus, it says that over 600,000 men made the Exodus, and so that doesn't even count the women and children or the livestock. And I've seen some really funny math that people have done where they say, look, you could make a single file line of people that's like 5 people wide, and they would stretch from where they left to the promised land. That number of people. Saul's army, it says there were about 200,000 foot soldiers. In David's census in 2 Samuel, it says that they numbered like 800,000 warriors, and there were 500,000 of them in Judah. Tons of examples of these. And what apologists have said is that these are, I think they call them idealized numbers. Is that the term, or is there a different term you've heard before?
I mean, that's one.
Okay.
Hyperbole is the general.
Yeah. Hyperbole. So there's this tactic they use to say, well, that was an idealized number. So the text is not wrong. It's just giving an account of it's being hyperbolic, I guess we should say, which is a little funny. I mean, we're not really here to debate inerrancy, really. I mean, we can talk about it, but I just wanted to hear your perspective on what kind of scholarship you know about this. Is this really a thing? Are apologists, if it is, are apologists using it correctly, or are they sort of abusing it? So I'll just give the floor to you to kind of explain what you know about this and examples you know about it as well.
Yeah. So there's sort of an underlying problem with utilizing the numbers in any given way. So, to take this into something that maybe isn't so hotly debated, or that the people would care so much about. If you read the Epic of Gilgamesh and you see Enkidu out in the steppe, and Shamhat, the prostitute, comes out to him, and it says that they have sex for 7 days and 7 nights, or 6 days and 7 nights. 7 is an idealized number, right? 7 shows up a lot. It's a big deal in the ancient Near East.
Yeah.
So it's not that they just picked some random ass number. That there's a reason that they pick these numbers. But there's a difference between, like, nobody would make the argument, oh, well, it says here that Enkidu and Shamhat had sex for 7 days and 7 nights. Well, that's just idealized. It's probably only for like an hour. Like, that would be a dumb thing to say.
Yeah, a little
right?
bit.
Yeah, and we recognize that that's dumb because like we're not approaching the text on its terms. Because the text on its terms, they're not, the genre is different from like a historical piece of work. So, we recognize that, and we recognize, you know, in the flood story that you have this period of time, 150 days, and then you have certain months that it recognizes, certain days of the month, and it happens that it's on these very precise timetable. It's not an accident, right? Um, the writers are doing something with these numbers. If you read through the Sumerian Kings list or the Sumerian King list, and it says, you know, um, I don't know, such and such king or Lugalbanda or Gilgamesh, but they reigned for 28,800 years,
Yeah, like a
or
number that
36,300 years.
yeah, that's the like just so impossible. That takes Methuselah to do such a
Right.
makes him look like a baby basically.
But I think the wrong question here is to ask, well, how long did they actually reign? I don't think that's the right question, because I think that that assumes something about the text. And of course, in the from the perspective of the apologist, they're assuming that it is presenting God's message, right, in an errant form,
Sure.
an inspired text. And so you can't have something wrong in what it intends to say. And so, when you have these numbers, they have to somehow be correct.
Yep.
And I think that's just starting with your conclusion and then backing into the data. And and you can see this, I think, really clearly in other places that hyperbole is um, sort of called upon as the weapon of choice to try to engage with the problems in the text. So if you look at something like 1 Samuel 15, where Saul fights the Amalekites, um, you know, people are very, very quick to say hyperbole, hyperbole, because when it says kill every man, woman, child,
Yeah.
suckling, infant, cattle, sheep, like, well, it can't mean that. Well, yeah, I mean, it can and
Yeah.
does,
Yeah. Well,
right?
it also
Um,
talks about his army had 200,000 people in it. So I I want to
yeah,
talk about the deaths and the wiping out people in our second segment here, but for now I just
mhm,
kind of want to talk about this use of huge numbers and like what
yeah.
they're trying to do there.
So, you know, I think you have to think about it from the perspective of who's writing and when they're writing. Um, and this is not something that is, I think, firmly set in scholarship. There's a volume that came out, I think, back in the 90s, where they were looking at Neo-Assyrian royal inscriptions, and kings would go on these campaigns. These Neo-Assyrian kings would go on campaigns, and they had a scribe that would sort of narrate in a manner of speaking the campaign. And you had these large numbers and sometimes round numbers, and it seemed like, well, that they can't mean that. But this is written at the time that the events are taking place. Like you can see um, Sargon, for example. There's a text called Sargon's Eighth Campaign, and the reason that it's noteworthy in this context is that as he went on his second and his third and his fourth campaigns and so on, the inscription, we have the original first campaign inscription and then the second, they get updated. Some of the information gets truncated and like added to. And so you can see sort of in, I don't know if real time is the right term there, but they're actually trying to record in some way what happened, right? So I think the issue here is we're not talking about writers from like the early Iron Age. sitting down with, a stylus, or, with some parchment, or and writing out what's happening on this campaign. That's not what's going on. These are much later writers that are looking back into the past. And I think idealized is fine, but here's where I think they're misusing it. I don't think that anybody sat down and said, all right, we have 600,000 fighting men coming out in the Exodus. We know that to be the case. I don't think anybody had data like that.
Yeah.
But what you see in Exodus and in the book of Numbers is you have these censuses, and you have two different censuses that are taken, one before the 40 years of wandering, and then one like at the end of the 38th year, something like that. And when they do the census, they break the numbers up by tribe. And when they break them up by tribe, they say, okay, Issachar had 46,500 people, and Zebulon had 36,000, whatever. And then at the end it says, and the total is 603,550 men. That's not an idealized number.
Right.
Right. And in fact, at the end of the 40 years of wandering, when they take the census again, the number is like 602,000 something. I can't remember exactly what it is, but it's different. It's slightly less, but it's still around the 600,000 number. So you can't just wish away the number. You can't just wish it away as an apologist. You can't just say, well, it's only like 500 people, because this is an idealized number. It must have been much, much smaller. Because the problem is the way that they're presenting the data in different places is with some specificity. The other issue that I think we see here with these large numbers is what apologists try to do to sort of skirt the issue itself by saying, well, the word Aleph doesn't mean 1,000, right? So you have this word 600 Alephim. It's the Hebrew word Aleph is the Hebrew word for 1,000. But in some cases, it can mean like a military unit, right? Which makes sense. It's sort of akin to like what, legion? I don't know. It's not my area. But and so what they do is they want to say, okay, well, maybe it means like 600 military units. And so that a military unit could be much smaller than 1,000. So then they kind of pare the number down, right? The problem, again, is that you have these censuses where it'll say things like he's the head, or other texts where it'll say he's the head over thousands, he's the head over hundreds, he's the head over like 50s, right? So these are very clearly numbers. It's not like he's the head of military units and then it switches to hundreds for some reason instead of something else. So I think the problem is recognized in the apologetic circles. I don't know that we have a very clear answer on what it is that the writers in like the 7th century did think or did mean.
Sure.
That's difficult to ascertain, because if you ask the question about the early 2nd millennium writers of the Sumerian king list, and you say, did they really think that such and such king like Alalgar, did he really reign for 36,000 years? Did they really think that? I don't know. I mean, like,
yeah, I mean, they could. I mean, it's like, it doesn't sound like the kind of people that think that, they write stories about people living to be 900 years old, that one guy somehow and his family had superhuman boat building abilities and were able to build a boat that big by themselves. Like, if you can believe that, I don't see why you couldn't believe these other things as well. So
yeah, it's interesting. I don't know if you know who Joel Baden is, but he's a phenomenal Old Testament scholar up at Yale. And I actually emailed him. I was having a bit of a back and forth with someone here online, another another specialist online, talking about these numbers, right? And I remember emailing Joel and saying, you know, just check my work here, right? Like here's what I think is problematic about this reading. And I was coming at it from the perspective of, okay, I'm going to adopt the apologist's position. And I'm going to say, for the sake of argument, I'm going to do this internal critique. It means thousand. I mean, it means a military unit instead of thousands. Well, if you do that, then it becomes a real problem in the numbers passage. And so I wrote that, and he wrote back and basically said, one, this is your own damn fault for engaging with these people. But two, you're trying to disprove his position about the, literal, reading of these numbers by showing him how it can't be a literal reading of these numbers. Like, when do you both realize that you're playing with like the wrong deck of cards or something like that? And he's got a fair point, because in the end, even though I'm trying to do this internal critique and adopt it, it's like it's sort of a no-go when you approach the text this way. I think instead we have to be moving away from questions like, okay, so this has to be historically reliable information.
Yep.
So how do we figure out that this is like, code for a smaller number? I think that's just coming at the text the wrong way. What is the right way? What is the specific way to deal with this? I don't know. I mean, I think it's a difficult question and one that we should continue to wrestle with. But I mean, like somebody like William Prop, he's talking about this 600,000 in the Exodus. He says, look, you can't just dismiss that the writer thought that there was something other than 600,000 people, or you can't just dismiss that the writer thought there was 600,000 fighting men, because like, look at the census numbers. Clearly, there's something going on here. We can't just say, oh, it's hyperbole, or oh, it's just idealized, or whatever.
Yeah. So my some thoughts that I had going through that is the idea of like using round numbers. Like, we're not sitting here trying to say, oh, well, if it was 99 but they said 100, therefore it's quote unquote wrong. Like the 100 Years' War, that war lasted for 116 years. But nobody goes around saying therefore the war didn't happen. And if I went to a football game and somebody asked me how many people do you think are here, I would just give you a number like 20,000. There's nothing wrong. I agree with using this idea of like round numbers, but like you can't round but it would make no sense for me to say 1 million people, or if I said everybody was there. That is something we say all the time. Oh, everybody was there. 8 billion people were there. Well, that's not what I meant. Right. But the Bible, I think, kind of makes itself committed to that kind of error, not that extreme. But when you say, like, you can't make this round argument for 600,000 people, for example, just men leaving Egypt, because the real number would be like double or triple that or whatever. So, yeah, it's really an awkward spot that it kind of puts itself in. And then the question is, why say something that is just so obviously like indefensible? And you kind of went over that, but I have a couple of things I wonder. When I recently started reading some historical books about the Spanish conquistadors and their first meetings with people in the New World. So I read a book about when Pizarro and his men went through the Inca Empire and decimated it and conquered it, and when Cortez and his men went to Tenochtitlan and met Moctezuma and burned the entire city to the ground and dismantled it brick by brick. One thing that did happen, I don't remember if it was in both of those accounts or just one of them, but either the Inca or the Aztec rulers, they would say, oh, we have an army of, and they would give this like ridiculously big number. And the conquistadors, by and large, they were like, yeah, we don't believe you. We think you're bluffing. Do you think that there may be some of that going on in some of these texts, especially like with because it describes armies in many of them. And that could also lead into the number of people they killed. Do you think that maybe there was some basically propaganda at work in doing that, or do you know if anybody, if that opinion is out there in scholarship or anything? And if we're just speculating, then
Or,
that's fine too.
yeah, I mean, the one thing that we can say is the texts are doing something. So there's certainly a level of propaganda always sounds so negative. Um, of course, it often is, right?
Yeah.
If you read through like the beginning of Exodus chapter 1, and it talks about how the children of Israel had gone down into Egypt, and God greatly caused them to multiply.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So much so that it started to scare the Egyptian populace, right? Then you read in the book of Numbers 22 to 24, where Balaam is called to curse the Israelites, and the reason is they're this massive horde on the other side of the Jordan, opposite Jericho, right? And they're just, the king says they're licking up all the ground right before them, like they're, in other words, they're this massive, unstoppable group. So, when if you have traditions like that, that say you had this massive group that got multiplied in Egypt, and you're trying to then represent that in your retelling of your nation's mythological past, whatever. Uh, I don't think it's fair to then come to the text and say, let's try to get that number down, because we know it couldn't have been. We know only, New Kingdom Egypt only had 3 million people in the whole thing.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think it's fair to do that. But as a writer or a redactor of these parts of the Hebrew Bible that are presenting this data much later, yeah, I mean, I think they're trying to present early Israel in a particular way, right? And some of them are doing so in such a way to present them as this massive group that came up out of Egypt with divine favor. So yes, I mean, I think we could probably talk, and we'd leave my area of expertise, obviously, to do this, but like we could talk about the political situation that would have obtained in like the early Achaemenid Empire or something, and what the Israelites are, or what the the Judeans are doing, coming back in the land, all that stuff. But yeah, I mean, texts do things, and these scribes are doing things with those texts, and so I don't think it's unreasonable at all to think that they're presenting the past in such a way, crafting it in such a way as to make a statement about how they believed early Israel to be.
Sure. There's also the case that we treat the Old Testament as a single work, but I mean it's anything but. I don't, off the top of my head, I don't know what the proposed timeline between when the first 5 books were written versus when Samuel and Joshua, which also have these big numbers in them, is. So to say that, I mean it's hundreds of years though, is it not?
I mean, all of that is fairly debated, because the Deuteronomistic history comes in the storyline after Genesis and Exodus. It doesn't mean that it actually was written later,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there are lots of different theories about how the Pentateuch was formed, how the former prophets were put together. Like all of that stuff is hotly contested in the field by subject matter experts, of which I am not, one of which I am not. So, but if people are interested in looking into that sort of thing, people like Joel Baden, Conrad Schmidt, Jeffrey Stackert, like these are just 3 that I pull off the top of my head, but like those are people that are writing extensively on the formation of the Pentateuch, and you know David Carr's got a really good book out about this as well. So it's debated.
Okay. I guess the only point I was going to make with respect to that is, if you try to apply an apologetic tactic to the numbers in the book, it betrays the fact that different people at different periods in time wrote that down. So, like, the excuse, even if it is true, the excuse, it may work for reading into the story in First Samuel or in Joshua, but then it doesn't work for Genesis, which is just such a later. It's more like Deuteronomy and Numbers, which are such earlier events. Even if they were, I don't know, written at the same time, like historically, they're supposed to have taken place at different time intervals. So that was kind of the only.
I mean,
Oh, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, you see this sort of thing, right, where an apologist will come back at this idea that uh, the text is portraying Israel as this massive group. Well, look over here at this portion of Deuteronomy, and it says that they were actually really small. It's like, yeah, okay, you're assuming univocality.
Yep.
You're assuming there's one voice, that one author. You can't. That doesn't work that way. And so I think that's you're hitting the nail on the head with that.
Okay. Kind of staying in the same place but transitioning a little bit. I wanted to talk about death in the Old Testament, right? I think that's the title for this live stream. So, I mean, like, the first place to start would be, with God telling Adam, on the day you eat this, on the day you eat this fruit, surely you will die, but they don't die. And there's all these arguments about, well, he didn't mean that day because a day to God is, 1,000 years or whatever. But like the word used there, yom, it always means 24 hours. And what I've also seen is there are multiple, 56 is the number I've seen, occurrences throughout the Bible where the way God specifically, like grammatically tells Adam, you will die, in all 56 other occurrences, somebody literally physically dies afterwards. So this would be like the 1 in 56 exception, which I don't think is really super tenable. But I want to talk about some others, because this also goes into a lot of the other debates you've had publicly online with people, typically with apologists doing it's like a atrocity excusing, right? But I kind of want to hear your perspective on what you think is going on. So like in 1 Samuel 15, it says all the Amalekites, except for King Agag and apparently some really, really good sheep, were wiped out. But then David encounters Amalekites again in 1 Samuel 30. So is this an example of they didn't, because this is another thing I've heard. It's not only the numbers that are idealized or exaggerated, but it doesn't really mean they totally obliterated everybody. But I find that a little bit weird when they specify who was not obliterated, the king and the sheep. So what's going on here? How were there Amalekites again in 1 Samuel 30 when in 1 Samuel 15 it says they were all wiped out?
So I have an article that I contributed to an edited volume called "Misusing Scripture: What Are Evangelicals Doing with the Text?" And this thing that Paul Copan always gets credited with, this hyperbole argument. He's pulling from Lawson Younger's dissertation in the early 90s. And Lawson Younger was leaning on the work of Mario Liverani, right? And there's no question that in ancient Near Eastern texts, hyperbole is used. Like John Collins, we did an interview with him one time, several years ago now, and I asked him about Liverani's and Lawson Younger's work and how it's being applied by modern day apologists, and he said they killed a lot of people and they claim to have killed even more, and that's a really good way to think about it. So the problem with hyperbole, in my opinion, is that it's like a kid with a hammer. Right? As soon as I have 3-year-old twins, if I were to hand them a hammer instantly everything they see would become a nail.
Yep.
And that's what apologists do with hyperbole. Right? You hand them the hyperbole hammer, and all of a sudden, any problematic number that they see, boom, hyperbole. Any problematic text, that boom, hyperbole. And it just doesn't work from the standpoint of the narrative itself. So there's something that we talk about called the internal frame of reference of the narrative. Right? And what is it that the narrative wants you to understand? What is its internal logic? And the editorial history of the book of First and Second Samuel is really complicated. I'm not qualified to speak on it because I haven't read through all the secondary literature. But there are certain things that I feel very comfortable saying, and that is that it's a redacted book, or it's an edited book in such a way that you have traditions in the book that are being reworked in such a way so as to make a statement about a particular king, for example. So here, in this case, in the previous chapter in 14, Saul seems to do okay, right? And the writer, or this redactor, this editor of the text, like that, it can't end that way. We got to have Saul being like the failed king and David being the best king, right?
Yeah.
And so you have this story about the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15, and you have this contrasted later. Saul fails with the Amalekites. David doesn't fail with the Amalekites. You have to have that parity. So the question on the writer's mind is, wait a second, I said back in 15.
Yeah.
We've got something in there where they're all gone. Damn it, how am I gonna do this? In the same way, the example that I like to give, again, I have 5 kids, so I've watched my fair share of Paw Patrol. And if you've ever watched Paw Patrol, there's a pup, I think it's Chase, that has this backpack that has a cannon on it that it can come out, and it'll shoot a net to catch somebody when they're falling. And in the intro to the show, you see somebody like falling, and you see Chase, he shoots this net, and it catches the person. Now, how? Right? What's the net hooked to? He just shot it up into the sky, right? The guy like fell out of an airplane or something. Like, so what's it hooked to? It's not important.
Yeah.
It's not relevant. Like, no kid is sitting there going, wait a second. Inconsistency. Where did that thing hook to? No, they just see a net, and it's a puppy that's talking. And if that's your biggest problem, what did the net hook to? Like, you're not paying attention to the rest of the show. But that's the point, is that the internal logic, stepping into the logic of the show, you don't ask that question.
Right.
And so here, part of the problem, a big part of the problem with the 1 Samuel 15 passage is the same problem that you see in the story about Achan back in Joshua 7, with the story about Jericho and how they're not supposed to take anything, and Achan does. I remember I was debating Cliff and Stuart Connectley several years ago, and Cliff, with his full chest, said, 1 Samuel 15, that's hyperbole. And I said, tell me what the hyperbole is. Because that's the question that needs to be answered. Because if the hyperbole is kill everybody, then why didn't Saul come back to Yahweh and go, whoa, big guy, hey, hold on, are we talking about like sports teams here? Yeah, like Steelers slaughtering the Ravens? Like, whoa, like I got most of them, right? Like, you didn't mean kill everybody. Why didn't he do that? Because that's not what it fucking meant,
Yeah.
right? The text, the internal logic of the text is that if you miss one, it fails.
Yeah.
Achan in Joshua 7, it's not like Achan turns to Joshua and says, wait a second, hold on. Yeah, okay. So Jericho is cherem, right? It's under the ban. Well, hold on. That's like hyperbolic, right? All I did is take like some some silver and a couple of cloaks. I mean, surely he didn't mean don't take anything. He just meant like don't take a lot of the stuff, right? I didn't take a lot. I took a little bit. Why doesn't that work? It's because that's not the internal frame of reference of the narrative.
Mm-hmm.
And so appealing to a later editorial redaction or a later editorial problem in First Samuel is to ask the wrong question. Right? It's to deal with the text not on its own terms, but on your terms.
Yes.
And how you want them to function. And I'll give one more example, just very briefly. Trying to make sense of how it is that Leviticus 25 can say, don't take Israelites as slaves. They have to be treated as hired workers. And then reconcile that with Exodus 21 and Deuteronomy 15, where it says you can take them and treat them as slaves, is to ask the wrong question. Right? This is not one voice writing, and it's not the point. In fact, the point of the writer of Leviticus, I think, is to very specifically say, like, turning Deuteronomy 15 and Exodus 21 on its head. They know you can't do that anymore, right? So it's a response to it. So, yeah, when somebody like Paul Copan and these other apologists that just read his book and just walk with it, what they fail to recognize, I think, is that they are coming at the text through their own interpretive lens, which is this is a divinely inspired book, so it all has to go together. Yep. So if I see in 1 Samuel 30 or 1 Samuel 27 or 2 Samuel 1 or whatever, that these Amalekites are here, if I'm reading the book of Esther and I see somebody that looks like it's a descendant of Agag, that this has to shed light on 1 Samuel 15. No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
Yeah, that's the I was kind of saying this earlier, just because like the problems we're pointing out are only problems if you adopt this like complete inerrancy framework that everything has to be literally the case or whatever. Like we're not trying to sit here and be like, haha, we just proved that the whole thing is false, or that God doesn't exist, or whatever. It just, you shoehorn yourself into such problems when you try to make these, when you take these apologetic approaches to dealing with the numbers and the rhetoric and everything. What was I going to say? With regard to, what the heck was it? I thought of something, but then it escaped. Oh, going back to what you were saying earlier with the, leaving some of them alive, not taking one. The hilarious thing about the taking things, that reminds me of the Cave of Wonders from Aladdin, when Apu, he just touches one little thing, but it's enough to make everything come crashing down. But with regard to the Midianites or whoever it is or the Amalekites, whichever one you were talking about earlier, it's not like the author could not have inserted in there King Saul negotiating with God, because that happens. Moses does it countless times. He's like, no, stop burning them. We're sorry. Or Moses intervenes before God can enact his wrath on people, So I guess I'll just repeat myself here, but it's not like the author could not have taken that approach. That's perfectly permissible in there.
Here's the other problem, and this is sort of the elephant in the room for me. Let's assume for a second, just for the sake of argument, that they're right, that there is hyperbole, and that some of them escaped. Are we sleeping better at night now?
Yeah, I know.
I don't understand what this gets you. Like I hear this all the time. Why, Josh, this is they didn't kill everybody. They just killed most of them. Oh, okay. I mean, sick flex, bruh.
Yeah. Why? Why can't the hyperbole be that anybody was killed? Why can't you take the approach of, well, look, nobody was actually killed. What they meant is they got them off of the land, because in that time people thought that the land was literally like the life force and the blood and the identity that people I'm making this up. But you could invent an argument that says actually nobody died. But what we're really doing is cheerleading less death as if that
Yeah, but
somehow is good when there's such a vastly better alternative.
yeah, I mean, look, th- Sennacherib, one of the Neo-Assyrian kings, there's an inscription where he talks about how he utterly destroyed, laid waste, killed everybody at this city of Hiramu. And then a couple lines later, he's saying, "And so I reorganized that district." Well, kind of hard to reorganize a district
If
if
they're all
you've
dead, yeah.
if you've annihilated them. So again, this is not a question of is there hyperbole in like the book of Joshua or something. Specifically in Younger's book, like looking at 9 through 12. Um, but the issue is one in the narrative itself. The narrative requires totality because, as you just said, Achan is just like Abu in Aladdin. All he's got to do is touch one, and that's it. It goes down here because it's the whole point of keeping the camp pure. And but even in the end, if you were to grant all of it and just say, yeah, they killed a shit ton of people, but not everybody. Some of them escaped. I mean, like, I don't get it. I don't get how that's how. What are they? How is that a win? I don't understand.
Yeah. Yeah, and the thing about like negotiating too, it's when I'm having a little bit of a brain fart if it's Abraham or whoever, Sodom and Gomorrah being destroyed. He's like, if I can just find like 10 righteous men, okay, well, then I will. Well, what about only 8? Okay, well 8. Well, what if I just literally only find one? So yeah, I mean, just kind of going back to the negotiating thing, that was always an option. I want. Do you watch the Star Wars movies, or do you not care for those too much?
I have seen them. I have seen them.
So, in in the Rise of Skywalker, it begins with what people call probably the absolute stupidest. It's not really a plot hole, but just like here you go. I'm not a movie person, so I don't know the terms, but it begins with somehow Palpatine has returned. People are like, that is the most unimaginative, non-story developing thing you've given to us here. And this I don't know if you have any unique commentary on the Midianites or if everything you said before would just apply to them. But in Numbers and then Judges, we have this same sort of thing going on. The Midianites are killed except for the little girls, but then they come back apparently in Judges 6. So it reminded me of somehow Palpatine has returned. So is this story is all this stuff you were kind of applying earlier? Is that just what we think is the same kind of thing occurring here, or is there any kind of unique perspective on this? Because it's kind of the same thing. It says they're all laid waste, but then all of a sudden they're back again.
Yeah, I mean, you have two different traditions, right? You have the view the book of Joshua puts forward, which is like this blitzkrieg, right? It's this, they go in, they hammer hard, they get everybody, like they knock everybody out very quickly. And then you have, in contrast to this, the book of Judges, which is a different tradition, which, most scholars I think would say is probably closer to how it actually was, right? You've got them trying to take this area, doesn't really work out terribly well, make some headway, it's a slower process of taking it like bit by bit. And so from an editorial standpoint, if you're trying to tie these things together, it's very similar to I think that there's definitely a large group of scholars today that would say that you have essentially two different origin stories, origin traditions for the nation of Israel. You have like the patriarchal narratives of Genesis 12 to 50, well, 12 to like 36 or whatever. And then you have the Exodus and wanderings, two origin blocks. How do you wed them together if you're trying to make cohesive narrative. Well, Joseph, right? The Joseph story becomes the mortar that connects. Like, how do we get Israel down into Egypt? How do we do that? Have the Joseph story, right? One of them goes down, there's this problem, and it becomes the mortar that you connect these two blocks together with.
Mm-hmm.
And so, like, how do you have one blitzkrieg tradition, that's then followed in another tradition by Judges, which explicitly says like they didn't do that and was much slower. Well, now you've got texts that say things like, well, they actually didn't take it all. They just, most of it or a little bit of it. And so this is an editorial discussion. That's where these things get worked out. The problem is, as you've stated, when you start from the position, this has to be univocal. It has to be a single inspired narrative. It cannot contradict with itself. You can't have these narrative inconsistencies. That you get this type of these harmonization attempts, right? And you try to make arguments. It can't mean this because look at this later text. Right? So it can't mean that because of this later text. It doesn't work that way.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I like all of that. The only other example in the that I like really knew of where, somebody in the Old Testament dies, but people say they didn't really die. Do you know about much about the story of Jephthah's daughter, how he ends up having to sacrifice her? Have you heard that people say, well, because he wept for her virginity, that just meant that she was going to serve in the Lord's tabernacle for the rest of her life, that she wasn't actually given up as a burnt offering?
Yeah. I mean, so if you look at the text, the Hebrew's pretty clear about what's going on here.
Yeah.
So he says, I will cause her to ascend as a whole burnt offering, an olah. There's not a lot of that's not ambiguous,
right,
in any way. It's the standard language for offering up a whole burnt offering as a sacrifice. The fact that she goes off to mourn for 2 months, her virginity, the text says she died having not known a man, or the text says, and so he fulfilled his vow as he had said he would, and she had not known a man. And this is why it becomes a tradition that, what is it, for, I don't know, I can't remember how many days, 4 days, something like that. The young girls go up and mourn for, Jephthah's daughter. And like, again, this is just sort of, I think, trying to skirt the problem, to skirt the issue. I don't see anything in the text that would lead me to believe that he didn't offer her up as just as he said. That's what the text says. He fulfilled his vow just as he had said he would.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't. There's nothing there that leads me to believe that. Now that doesn't mean that it doesn't mean like a later writer who's trying to put this story in such a way that it doesn't look like we're offering someone as a sacrifice, couldn't intend something in the way that was written. But again, I think this is to sort of ignore the bigger issue, and that is what was the tradition originally, if you're going to make that argument, in the same way that child sacrifice in the Hebrew Bible in general, if you, or the fact that you have a divine pantheon, like these are things that the text seems to try to wrestle with in real time, right? And to try to say, well, maybe Yahweh is El, right? But there's a reason that it's having to do that. You don't spin things that don't need to be spun.
Yeah. Well, that's a good way of putting it. I like that. I have a question that is very different to what we've been talking about. Kind of, sort of. I mean, it's not about death or numbers or anything like that, but it's about the Bible. And you're the kind of person that I think. Well, I'm just interested in your take of it because I would value your take. So it's a little bit clunky. I just wrote it out. It's kind of one of those shower thoughts. But the Old Testament is essentially the Hebrew Bible. But the Bible as a whole, the way it's, bought and sold, that's a Christian book. That's how we think of it. The Bible as a whole, which contains the Hebrew Bible, is a Christian book, though. Do you think that the Old Testament we have in our Bibles is pretty faithful to Judaism, or do you think that it really has sort of major changes to it, or do you think that that's just kind of a matter of interpretation?
I guess it depends on what you mean by changes.
I mean, if I don't know, like a Jewish person reading the Old Testament, would they look through that and be like, they're getting this all wrong? Or would they say, no, that this is right, but you Christians are interpreting what it says completely wrong? Because obviously
Yes.
Jews have a different interpretation of the Old Testament than Christians. But is it because the Old Testament we have in our Bibles, a Jewish person would say, this isn't correct? There are some, they may be minor but important things in here that are wrong, or or do you think it's just all a matter of interpretation?
Yeah, no, I definitely think it's the latter.
Okay.
So, whereas, for example, a Christian is going to read Genesis 2 and 3, 3 in particular, and say, all right, that's Satan in the garden.
Yeah, the snake, yeah.
Yeah, it's not really Satan. Now, if you're coming at that through the Christian interpretive lens, then you can say that's Satan, right? Or if you're going to read Isaiah 7:14 and say, yep, this is a prophecy about Jesus. So somebody who's Jewish is going to say, oh, not. Isaiah 53, here you go. Nope, not. So I don't think it's a question that they would look at the text and say this isn't right. The order of the books is different. But I mean the text itself is the text. But
Okay.
that's why they call it the Hebrew Bible as opposed to the Old Testament.
Yeah, I was interested in that because I didn't know. Like, if you took a Hebrew Bible, like if you went to synagogue, and you're like, give me one of your Bibles, and then you just, went to a hotel and grabbed the KJV or whatever version is in the sock drawer there, and you just looked at them side by side, would they basically be identical, or would there be like major redactions or additions?
Oh, no.
It sounds like they'd basically be the same. And that's actually,
Yeah.
I think that's interesting, and I think that's kind of beautiful, because although, the Bible that these, Christians were writing and printing, and that spans the last several hundred years, I think it's actually really neat and, like I said, kind of beautiful that they're preserving that Old Testament as the way the Jewish people would say, yes, you have preserved this correctly. You're reading it wrong, but you've preserved it correctly. I wanted to know that because I didn't know, but I guess good for them for preserving history. But as far as like interpretation goes, a little bit of a different story, I guess.
Yeah, and I would definitely encourage you to. I mean, there are obviously lots of very talented, like Jewish rabbis here in this online sphere. Definitely ask them the question: what's their opinion? Like how they would view that, because that's like obviously their opinion is going to be the one that matters in that question. But yes, as far as my opinion goes, the order of the books can be different in places, or is different in places, but the content is the same.
Mm-hmm. So at this point, it's been about 57 minutes right now. Did you want to take a look at that video that we kind of teased earlier? Do you want to do that?
We can do a couple minutes of it. Yeah, I think that'd be good.
Sure. Yeah, and it's, he's probably going to say in the beginning of it everything that's sort of that we need to hear,
Yeah.
everything that we don't want to hear, but everything
Right.
that we're going to hear from it. And then I had one super chat come in, so we'll definitely be able to tackle that afterwards. But if anybody else that's still with us has one you want us to check out, go ahead and do that. Let me just make sure that you can hear this. You can still hear that?
Yeah. I can.
Okay, so I'll just back up a second. So this is Frank Turek, everybody, and he's taking a question on why does God allow slavery to occur? So what does Frank have to say?
Yeah, my money's worth here. Dr. Turk, there's a new book out, and it claims to be the divine word of God. And it says, as for the male and female slaves whom you may have, it is from Guatemala that you may acquire them. You may also acquire them from among the Guatemalans residing with you and from their families who are with you who have been born in your land. They may be your property. You may keep them as a possession for your children after you, for them to inherit as property. These you may treat as slaves, but as for your fellow Americans, no one shall rule over the other with harshness. And so my question is that a book you'd like to own?
So he's trying to trick him here, which I don't know if that's super wise, because I'm certain Frank knows where this is going, because it says you may not rule over your fellow Israelites with brutality, but from the nations around you may, you may take slaves.
Yeah, I mean, I think he probably knows that Frank knows that, right? But it's one of these that I got this far in the video. I couldn't take much more of Frank talking, but like this is sort of attack that I take, and that is to put it in an ancient Near Eastern context and say, would you be okay with it here? Like I was talking about Sennacherib earlier. In that article that I wrote, I said, look, Sennacherib claims to have killed everybody, but we know that he didn't, right? He just killed a whole bunch of people. Are you coming to Sennacherib's defense now?
Yeah.
Are you saying, well, he didn't kill everybody?
Yeah.
He was obeying Asher. He was obeying his God. He says that the people there at Hiramu were evil, right? So, I think it was just. It was good.
Yeah.
No, of course you're not doing that. So
it could have been worse. It could have also been a lot better. But let's hear what Frank's response to that is.
Yeah, Luke, you're talking about, first of all, do you know what slavery is in the Old Testament?
Just the question. Is that a book that you would like to own? Would you think that?
Well, it depends on what slavery means, and it depends on what property means.
It could be a book that you would want to own.
It depends on what it means.
Wow.
What does it mean?
Okay.
What does slavery mean in the Old Testament?
Yeah, well, slavery here, it defines it. So it says, these you may treat as slaves, but as for your fellow Americans, no one shall rule over the other with harshness. So meaning for your fellow Americans, do not treat them with harshness. Why? Because the slavery that we're talking about here is harsh slavery. Okay, so whatever it is, it's harsh.
What is this passage from in the Bible? Because you're just putting Guatemalans in for Mennonites or whatever.
Well, I think, okay, I'm pretty sure I know exactly where he's going to go, because there's two directions that people tend to go. One, there was no slavery, it was indentured servitude. Right. Which, I mean, that's so tired. It really was chattel slavery. So I'll let you talk about that for a little bit here. And then the other excuse typically is if it was slavery, it wasn't the same thing, because it's kind of the indentured servitude argument. But they say, well, they were slaves, but they were free to go. It was different. But it explicitly says you can bequeath the children of your slaves as inherited property for life or whatever. So I'll let you basically take it away with what you would say in response to that, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, and I think I know why he read back verse 46, the end of verse 46, but I think that's fine. I think he should read again 44 through 46, because this is the common apologetic argument, right? Like, well, it's not antebellum slavery. And instead of where I am today with this is I say, don't tell me what it's not. Tell me what it is, right? Because the text tells you what it is. And the text, like he said it, right? I think his name's Luke. Like, own them as property. And Frank can blow smoke all he wants. I doubt he knows Hebrew. And if he does, he's being incredibly dishonest then with the text, right? Because the word is achuzah there, and achuzah is landed property. And this is the only place that humans are referred to as achuzah, right? They're part of the landed property, the inherited property that gets passed on. That if you sell it to somebody else, it ultimately in the Jubilee reverts back to you. So if anything, if a slave is sold to somebody else, they revert back to the master that sold them in the Jubilee. So like this does not help Frank at all. And yeah, I mean, like the text is more explicit in saying that you pass them on as an inheritance.
Mm-hmm.
You may make them serve la'olam, right, to eternity, whatever, forever. That's an indefinite period of time in the future. So yeah, Frank is just like he's just either he doesn't know the data or he's being incredibly dishonest with it.
There's also, my memory is telling me Deuteronomy 21. I don't remember if that's correct, but there is a prohibition on kidnapping. And so people say they couldn't possibly have even been doing slavery because it says you may not do kidnapping. And it's like, those aren't the same thing, like.
I guess there wasn't slavery in the American South after 1807.
Yeah. I mean, you can make prisoners of war slaves. They're not kidnapped. They're prisoners of war. You can have a law that says you may not kidnap, but there can be like to pretend that those are the same thing or that one debunks the other. Yeah, it's just pretty silly. But then the other thing they do is they point to, the verse that says you may not rule over your fellow Israelites with this kind of brutality or whatever. And I don't know if there's more than one occurrence of that, but there is a prohibition on the sort of chattel slavery of Israelites. Like they can only be like debt servitudes or whatever. And it's just like, but in other places, it explicitly says that you can do worse than that.
But see, the thing is that, so there are several questions that are at play here. And unfortunately, apologists try to sort of in your brain mix them all together. And if they can mix them all together and then show you how one doesn't work, then that means the whole, you have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? So that the reality here is that Exodus 21, 2-6 says you can take Israelites as chattel slaves. In fact, the what do you call them? The non-player, shit. What is it in a video game where you have a character that, Megan's gonna be so upset with me, because she plays Horizon, an NP.
Yeah, NPC. That's what I thought you were getting to. But yeah, non-playable character, NPCs. Yeah.
There you go. So, that in Exodus 21, 2-6, the text says, if male debt slave comes in, he serves for 6 years and goes out in the 7th. He comes in by himself, he leaves by himself. He comes in with a wife, and his wife goes out with him. If he comes in and his master gives him a wife, who is a chattel slave, and they have children who are chattel slaves,
Mm-hmm.
when he leaves, they don't go with him. Why? They're chattel. So, then he can opt to become chattel so that he can stay with his wife and his children. So the idea that it's only foreigners that could be chattel slaves in Exodus 21 is just not the case, right? And these NPCs, that I guess that's what they would be, like they're characters that move the plot along, right? That's sort of what the wife and the children are in that context, is in the background, sort of moving the plot along to make this point about the law. And this is just nonsense. It's just a nonsense argument. Again, if Frank knows Hebrew or he's read the text in any kind of detail, this is a disappointing display.
I've never known Frank to do anything but disappoint. Well, to be fair, sometimes he obfuscates. So, what's
his PhD in? Do we know?
Oh, geez, I don't know. Probably philosophy or theology, I would guess.
Is it a PhD? Is it a D-Min, or do we know?
We can look. I can look it up right now. I will here. I'll tell you what the audience question was for you. It's not going to be a super short answer, I feel like, on your end, but and while you're doing that, I will look into Frank. So
Sounds good.
Ligma FPV, thank you, asked, Dr. Bowen, would you please explain the difference between plagiarism and Genesis Exodus with the Sargon legend and the Epic of Gilgamesh? It just seems like blatant plagiarism from my primitive eyes.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So when we use the word plagiarism, I don't like it because it tends to have this moral component when we use it. And I think there's probably a more precise way to speak about this. And by the way, this is one of the places that an apologist will grab hold. Like if people watched that, what's his name? That apologist that got really, really popular recently.
Wes Huff.
Wes Huff, thank you. His seeming confusion on this topic in that discussion with Billy Carson was just, it's when I went on Myth Vision and talked about it because it was just really pronounced to me. On the one hand, he said Genesis 1 is a response to, I think he used the term apologetic. It's an apologetic against this Akkadian, very, very important Akkadian New Year's text called the Enuma Elish. Well, if it's a response to it, if it's a polemic or if it's an apologetic or whatever, well, then it's dependent upon it, right?
Yeah.
Like it knows about it and it's responding to it. You can't, it's the only way that works. But then later he tried to say that, well, you have these like similar themes, but it's, all creation accounts have these things. Well, then that's different, right? That's the opposite of what you're saying. You're saying that they just coincidentally had similar things. So, okay, when we talk about the precise term I think we should be using to make it so apologists can't weasel their way out of this is intertextuality. Intertextuality. And intertextuality, we see it everywhere in the ancient Near East, not just in the Hebrew Bible. It's as prolific, I think, or prolific as I don't know why I'm blanking on the term here. It's as common, perhaps, as rap artists utilizing other people's, phrases to respond to them.
Yeah.
Right. So like Eminem, when Eminem says, "But you already know who the fuck you are, Kelly."
Yeah.
Like we can't say that he's talking about someone named Kelly, and it just happens that R. Kelly is, no. I mean, he's clearly thinking about the singer R. Kelly because it's a whole fucking song's about. And it's a response to this thing that he had with R. Kelly. So it's dependent upon, in that way, there's intertextuality with that person. Okay. So in the ancient world, as we do honestly today with like hymns or with Christmas music, like you have interplay with a new work tying back to an old work, responding to it, right? Or engaging with it or developing it or whatever. That's intertextuality. So the text these two texts are interacting with one another. So yeah, I don't think there's any question that the flood story in Genesis 6-9 is utilizing the framework and the storyline, the basic storyline of Atrahasis and Gilgamesh Tablet 11. Like, I don't think there's any question about that. There are, I think they go to great lengths to show you that they're doing that, right? In the terms that they use. But there's a reason that they're doing it. They're drawing your attention to that story so that they can make a theological statement about it. So I know I've probably given this example you guys may have heard this, but in the Gilgamesh epic, in Tablet 11, or in the Atrahasis, which is Atrahasis story, which is where Tablet 11 gets its story, the god that sends the flood is Enlil. And Enlil is said when he sends the flood, he did an evil thing. It's an evil thing that he did. And everybody knows this. Like, everybody's going to know this story, Gilgamesh, right? Everybody's going to know this flood story. It's going to be sort of part of the world in which they live. It's the water that they're going to swim in, I guess, to some degree. I mean, these scribes, they lived in Babylonia for 70 years. So when they write this story, everybody knows the plot line, right? They know that Enlil's a bad guy, and Ea has to come along and kind of save the day. Well, this makes it stand out in Genesis 6:5 when it says, God looked down, and all of the thoughts of men's hearts were only wicked continually.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There's a polemic here. The text is saying, yeah, in your story, mankind is just being noisy because they're trying to do the work that the gods created them to do. And Enlil does this terrible thing by sending the flood. In our story, it's mankind that's evil, not the God.
Yeah.
Our God's not evil. Mankind is. And Yahweh has to come in and destroy, because that's the only just thing that he could do. Like, that's the intertextuality. So I understand what the super chat question is asking, and I understand that thought process, right? But we want to be even more precise when we talk about it, because an apologist, unfortunately, will grab hold of that and say, oh, show me if it's plagiarism, right? Like, show me all the specific things, that interact between Enuma Elish that are copied over from Enuma Elish in Genesis 1. And you'll be like, well, I mean, I can't show you like copying, right? And I think that's where there's a more precise way to talk about it in its intertextuality.
Yeah. Just a few more thoughts before we close here, but yeah, that and I wasn't aware that he said that about Genesis, but that's pretty wild for a Christian to tell you that Genesis is written as a response to something, especially Genesis 1, because, depending on what you're trying to sell, if you're trying to sell that Genesis is history, and Genesis is supposed to be, it starts off with literally the creation of everything. So it's like, how can a story that's supposed to be the first story of the first thing that ever happened be a response to something that literally presupposes that there's an alternative narrative, out there, and they wrote it. That just undermines it. It turns it kind of, I don't want to say into propaganda, but kind of like historical fiction. So you'd have to ask them, like, okay, that's fine if you think that, but do you think that Genesis is literal history, or do you think it's merely just a story that they told to convey a message? Because you get tied in knots with that kind of thing. Dinesh D'Souza just absolutely hilariously, when he was talking to Alex O'Connor, this happened to him because he said that Genesis is literally true, but it's not science, so it doesn't get the facts straight. And Alex is like, but it says that the sun was created after the earth. We know that's not the case. So is it true or is it not true? And he just went and tried desperately to change the subject. Because again, you're trying to sell that it's true and it's history, but it's told in its own unique way. I was like, well, yeah, but the details are literally wrong. So, like, don't you see what you're putting yourself through by doing this?
Yeah, and this is why, just so it's clear, this is why the majority of like evangelical academics, people that are actually Near Eastern specialists, they don't hold to this fundamentalist view of the text.
Yeah,
like that I would say that Genesis 1 through 11 is mythological, right? It's in the genre of the wider ancient Near East, and that's not a problem for them. Which is why it's always funny to me to see people really dying on that hill, because it's like, go read the people that are in your camp, right?
Well,
Go read them, because they don't even hold this position.
well, those people are lost in their sin. You forgot.
Well, no,
Yeah, I've heard.
terrible. It's a terrible thing.
We're probably not gonna have time to go into it. And I don't know how much you've ever heard of it, but I hear this story that or this claim that Genesis 1 is a temple inauguration, and so it didn't and I don't even remember like what that's supposed to mean or whatever, and we won't have time to really get into that, I suppose. Frank Turek's doctorate is in ministry, a doctor of ministry. I don't know what that even means.
Yeah. So it's not a terminal degree. Amen is something that I'll have to give. I mean, it depends on which kind of. Where did he get it from?
I will tell you in 4 seconds. George Washington. No. That's not. That's his master's degree. It was in. Oh shoot. Southern Evangelical Seminary. Whatever that is.
Yeah, like my homiletics professor when I went to seminary had like 2 doctorate of ministries and 2 DMins. They're not terminal degrees. They're not like research degrees. And that's fine. I mean, I'm not trying to like knock a DMin, but I'm going to knock his because it frustrates me. I hope you can see I'm really careful about the things that I comment on, and when like something starts to leave my field of expertise, I draw attention
always
to
say
that.
So, yep.
Like that is the opposite of what I see people like Frank Turek doing, who will just regurgitate. And I mean, like the number of times I've seen him put Paul Copan's book up, and that's like the final word on a particular topic, which I like Paul. He's a nice guy. Like I've interacted with him. Like we had a bunch of back and forths after I wrote my article, because he published a public response and I published one back to him. But like he's not a specialist in the field, and it's just Anyway, not very careful.
Yeah. So like, how do you get is it like a lifetime achievement award kind of thing, or like I looked it up and it said there is like a research component into it, but like you don't publish a thesis or like add to the scholarly body of work in any real way.
It's not a research degree. I've never spent a lot of time looking at it, but it's a ministry degree. So I think you can get them in 2-3 years. I'd have to go back and look. Nobody should quote me on that. But it's not a research degree. It's not intended to be a terminal degree.
Okay.
That I know of.
Okay.
So.
Well, that's I guess that was kind of all the information that I had that I wanted to go through. So, thank you very much for giving me your time. You can go ahead and, tell folks like what you're up to, anything you have coming up. You probably haven't been watching, but Kip's been here in the chat, and he informed me that you actually are going. Was it Dr. Turek tomorrow, or somebody else? You guys are actually going over something.
Oh yeah, that's right. We're going. Do you know Justin from Deconstruction Zone?
Oh yeah. Yep.
Yeah, we're going to be going on his channel to look at. I've lost what videos we're looking at. I can't remember from show to show.
That's fine.
That's so terrible.
You're very busy. I mean, I don't even know what I'm doing tomorrow, and I have it written down somewhere. So that
well, so I'm writing. I teach to public. I offer courses in Hebrew and Sumerian right now. So I've got 2 Hebrew classes that I'm teaching online, and then a Sumerian class. And so I decided I'm going to write my own Hebrew, Learn to Read Ancient Hebrew book, because we have a Learn to Read Ancient Sumerian book already, a couple of them that we wrote, Megan and I wrote. So I figured I'd write one. So I'm just finishing up the 2nd volume of that. And of course, if people don't know, I always like to plug Megan. Megan is the host of Bart Ehrman's Misquoting Jesus podcast. So if you think that I'm smart in any way, she leaves me behind in the smart department. So definitely go check her out, Misquoting Jesus.
Okay, very awesome. Well, I already said thank you, but I'm happy to say it again. Thanks for coming on, and I will see all of you tomorrow.